And now you can hear from the person you have all really come to hear from.
My Lords, as I rise to address your Lordships for the last time, I am standing immediately behind the place from which I made my maiden speech in 1979, moving an amendment in a Scottish Criminal Justice Bill, which amendment, I'm glad to say, was accepted. A short distance may make a big difference in status, as your Lordships will have noticed. I thought it might be of interest to give a summary of the responsibilities I had in the 2 offices I held, which are now completely changed, if your Lordships permit me to do so. Before doing so, I wish briefly to support this second reading. Since most of the time since 1972, I have been a member of a lighthouse authority with concern for the vital importance of seamen and their terms of service. Our legislation can regulate these for seamen that serve within our territorial waters. But if part of that service is outside those waters, special provisions are required. This bill deals neatly, I think, with such a case, and I give it my full support. I now come, with your Lordship's permission, to say a little about the 2 offices I held. The first was the Lord Advocate of Scotland, with the first 2 responsibilities I mentioned shared with the Solicitor General for Scotland. First, the representation of the government in the courts of Scotland, advising the government on Scots law, and also in conjunction with the Attorney General on European law, which at that time applied throughout the United Kingdom. To assist in that responsibility, there was a staff of lawyers and other civil servants in the Lord Advocate's office in London. We had responsibility for drafting the bills for Scotland and also those parts of the United Kingdom bills which required special attention to conform with the Scots law requirements. The second responsibility was that we were responsible for the prosecution in service in Scotland, consisting of the Procurator Fiscal Service throughout Scotland, the Crown Office in Edinburgh, staffed by members of the Procurator Fiscal Service, the Crown Agent at the head of that service, and advocates who were appointed from the Scottish Bar to make judgments on the most important cases. 2 members of your Lordship's House, the Noble Lord Campbell of Pittenweem, and the Noble and Learned Lord Hope of Craighead, were in that team. I personally took some of the fatal accident inquiries that were the responsibility of my office and also some of the prosecution litigation. That concludes these responsibilities that I shared with the Solicitor General of Scotland. I was invited by a number of departments in this House to assist with their legislation, and the Noble Lord that spoke earlier has given one example, at least, of that happening. This gave me an opportunity to know the departments extremely well, and I cherish that experience. I also was nominated by the Attorney General, then Sir Michael Havers, to represent the government in cases in this House and also in the Court of the European Union. In representation in this House, I had in one case the advantage of having the Noble and Learned Lord Brown of Eton under Heywood, as my junior. Needless to say, we won. I was invited by a number of departments to assist in this House with their legislation. And that, I think, as I said, was important for developing my chances in later times. After 5 years in the office of Lord Advocate, I was nominated by the then Secretary of State for Scotland to be a judge in the Scottish courts. When that became known in this House, I happened to be paying my bill in the Peers' dining room when Lord Elwyn Jones said to me, "James, I've just heard you have been appointed a Scottish judge." "I'm very sorry. I had hoped better things of you." I was appointed a Lord of Appeal in Ordinary in 1985 and served in that capacity until October 1987, when I was invited to become the Lord Chancellor as my predecessor and excellent friend, Lord Michael Havers, had resigned on the ground of ill health. So I became the Lord Chancellor, an unprecedented experience for a member of the Scottish Bar who had not been a member of the English Bar. The first responsibility of that office was to officiate in this House, and that I did for almost 10 years. This involved taking part as the Lord Chancellor, independent of the government, when I sat on the woolsack or stood in front of the woolsack. But it also involved representing the government, and when doing so, I stood 2 steps to the left. It was the Liberal Democrats who were there at that time. Things have changed in that respect, as your lordships know. In the House, the Lord Chancellor presided. He represented the House on ceremonial occasions, taking part where appropriate. He received new members on their introduction, first in his office and then to the House, in a ceremony wearing a hat that Matthew Paris described as a Cornish pasty. He received and visited foreign speakers of Parliament, presidents, prime ministers, and senior judges. He attended meetings of Commonwealth and European speakers in company usually with the Speaker of the House of Commons and by the Clerk of the Parliaments or an official of his department. He also attended other ministerial meetings, and as you've heard, he read prayers if the bishop was prevented from attendance. I think I had 3 opportunities to do that in the 10 years where I was Lord Chancellor. The Lord Chancellor was a member of the Cabinet. I was given 4th place in the Cabinet on appointment. When Mrs. Thatcher retired, I sat next to the Prime Minister and paid her the Cabinet's tribute on its behalf, the draft being kindly prepared by Robin Butler. I was in the Cabinet as a member of the Judiciary and the Legislature, the others being members of the Legislature. As a law officer, I had not been a member of the Cabinet. It was a tremendous honour and heavy responsibility to represent the judiciary in the Cabinet, but I felt that it was a very necessary and important responsibility, and I was anxious to discharge it properly. I had the responsibility for the civil law that was not already the responsibility of another department. This included organisations such as the Law Commission, the National Archives, and the Land Registry. I introduced to this House legislation that was in accordance with the government policy for the Lord Chancellor's Department, and also other legislation which the ministers concerned invited me to lead on in this House. The most important of the bills that I had responsibility for, I think, were the Children Act of 1989 and the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act of 1990. Both of those have stood the test of time in their structure ever since. I think, looking back on it, that is due to the amount of consent that we got in this House, and also, I think, in the House of Commons. But of course, I was primarily concerned with this House, with the kind of consent we were able to work up in the course of negotiation here. I also introduced, for the first time, a bill that mentioned the Secret Service publicly in Parliament at the request of the then Home Secretary. I also was responsible for various legal aid and other enactments and statutory instruments. I introduced the Courts and Legal Services Bill, which has already been referred to, which came along as a matter of some controversy with the Bar and some of Her Majesty's judges. I don't intend to describe the detail of that any further than it has been done already. I am glad to say that it went through both Houses of Parliament with very little amendment. And so far as I know, nobody has tried to amend the principles of that bill since. The Lord Chancellor was head of the judiciary and was responsible for the court system and provision for the judges, for example, for training and accommodation on circuit. Toward the end of my time in office, responsibility for the Magistrates' Court was transferred to the Lord Chancellor. Like Lord Hilsham before me, I presided on a substantial number of sittings of the Judicial Committee of the House or of the Privy Council. I had the responsibility of nominating the senior judges to the Queen and the most senior to the Prime Minister. And to assist me in that responsibility, there was a small group of officials in the Lord Chancellor's department. This time is sometimes referred to as the tap on the shoulder time. I have to say that I have no memory of tapping anyone on the shoulder as a preliminary to seeking to nominate him or her as a member of the senior judiciary. The circuit judges and other judges were also appointed on the nomination of the Lord Chancellor, and again the group in the department assisted. I took the view eventually that it was right that it should be done by a committee interviewing the candidates, including a magistrate, because I thought it was important that the judicial quality of the person would be estimated. I made it my business to try and estimate that as carefully as I could. I had the opportunity sometimes of hearing candidates when I was sitting as the presiding judge in a session of a judicial committee, but I also had opportunity to study that in other ways. All the judges I nominated came to this House to be sworn in by me. My wife entertained them and their families in the River Room to tea or coffee as appropriate. And I do believe that that particular service was very much esteemed by the people who got it. I do not think it continued. As direct rule operated in Northern Ireland, I had similar responsibilities there for the court system and judicial appointments. My lords, a senior judge had been killed. The Chief Justice had been shot at, and a judge's home had been blown up. So these appointments were a solemn responsibility. I am humbly thankful to Almighty God that no further damage was done to the judiciary in that way, although the risk continued. I should also like to mention the wonderful way in which the court service in Northern Ireland dealt with its work. On one occasion, their headquarters were damaged by an explosion at the weekend, and first thing on Monday morning, they were clearing up the broken glass. The Lord Chancellor had the responsibility of nominating Queen's Counsel for England and Wales. Again, he was assisted by the group in the department. I consulted the senior judges, and I considered it right to have regard not only to success of advocacy in court, but also to the importance of sound advice to clients that might prevent them having to go to court. This concludes my summary of the responsibilities I held in office. All are now changed, so I hope a record of them may be of interest. I handed over to the noble Lord, Lord Irwin of Lairg, who I regret to say is now on leave of absence on account of his ill health. My lords, this house has a special place in my regard, and I wish to thank from the bottom of my heart all the members of this house, past and present, who have shared with me members of it. I feel the same for all the staff of the House. It applies to the Clerk of the Parliaments and all the staff in the offices, the staff of the usual channels, the committee staffs, the expenses staffs, the doorkeepers, the attendants, to those that help us in the restaurants, in banqueting, on computers and telephones, the police and security, the engineers, and the people who help us in many other ways, including, of course, the cleaners. And I particularly want to mention those ladies whose job it is to clean the huge number of books that are covering our corridors. I have spoken to them very often, and it's wonderful to see how cheery they are, considering the nature of their employment. They really do a great job, and I would like to thank all the staff for the help that they have been to me. I wish to thank my family for all the support they have given me. And above all, I have to thank my dear wife of 64 years for her devoted support and wonderful patience. I have been twice appointed a life peer, and having reached 95 years of age, and now been given the opportunity to retire from membership, I do it with gratitude and the happiest of memories on July the 22nd. My lords, I believe that I have been sustained until now by answers to what we pray for at our opening every day. Thank you very much.